Hello, good afternoon. I do believe that we are now live. So firstly, thanks to everyone for joining us on the discussion today. My name is Mark Giles and I'll be your host kicking things off. Before I hand over to our moderator, John Edgerton, I'd like to introduce our panelists. We have Cindy Novak, Lab Operations Systems Manager, Bristol Myers Squibb. Yikin Lee, Research IT, Biologics and Informatics for Eli Lilly. Robin Brower, Digital Lab Leader, AstraZeneca. Laura Williams, Workflow and Technology Strategist for GSK. And finally, to formally introduce our moderator, John Edgerton, who is Head of Sales for LabTwin. So, goes without saying, we're all very excited to have everyone here today for what we'll find an interesting discussion, focusing on the lab of the future, but more specifically, voice assistants and how they can enhance the efficiency and quality of R&D documentation, enabling effortless real-time data capture and access at the bench. Before we start, I would like to take a minute to remind attendees you've all joined in listen-only mode, which means that you are muted. There are various areas within the system that I would encourage you to use. There is a section for Q&A where you can log on and ask questions for your host, the moderator, or the panelists. There are some handouts from LabTwin, which have some useful information about the voice assistant solutions. And you'll also get the opportunity to watch this session again. So we do have a playback feature. So we'll ensure you receive a copy of the session post-event. Finally, your feedback is very important to us, and we do encourage you to fill out the survey post-event. This will enable us to shape our future events, but also ensure we deliver maximum value to our audience. Now, I will turn you over to your moderator for the session, John Edgerton.
Thanks very much, Mark. So I'm really excited to be moderating this roundtable, everyone. It's going to be centered, as Mark said, on digital transformation, specifically how voice technology can play an important role in R&D, as well as challenges around the introduction of this kind of technology in more regulated spaces, such as in GMP. So in terms of structure, I'm going to start with a short 10-minute presentation to kind of set the scene. From there, I'm going to open things up to the panelists, where I'll be asking a series of questions for us to all discuss. And I'll look to pick one of the panelists at random just to kick each question off. And then from there, I'll intend to just kind of let the discussion happen naturally, and let's see what happens. But just as exciting as the topics that we're going to be discussing today is the fact that we have such an amazing set of panelists with us. So I'm really happy to introduce, as Mike did, Cindy from Bristol Myers Squibb, Helen from Eli Lilly, Robin from AstraZeneca, and finally Laura from GSK. So I'd like to take this opportunity to thank the panelists for joining and everyone else that's attending today. For those in the audience, we have kind of a Q&A area on the bottom right-hand corner of the screen where you can kind of ask questions and make comments. And wherever possible, we'll look to try and incorporate those into the discussion that we're all having. So let's take a look at voice assistants. So even though a lot of lab software today exists to support documentation, scientists are still very much disconnected from them during the actual execution of the experiment. And they're unable to properly document this whilst the work is actually being done. So what this means is that most of them end up delaying the documentation. And this delay can vary anywhere between 5 minutes up to sometimes 4 weeks. And this is what we've been seeing working with some of our current rosters of clients. The situation almost always results in inadequate documentation, increased human error, a cognitive overload for the scientists or the technicians that are kind of running 4, 5, 6 experiments in parallel. They're constantly switching their attention from basically the pipette and the pen. And because it's not easy to use an ELN at the bench, paper ends up still being broadly used in the lab. And this results in extra time spent transcribing notes from annotated protocols, paper notebooks, post-its, the back of a glove with a Sharpie, and so on. So we're currently seeing this taking roughly 30 minutes per day, but we've also seen that in certain situations this can actually also be more as well. We're quite confident that this time can be invested more wisely, because it is quite valuable. Plus, when considering more regulated environments, this is even more critical, as every step needs to be confirmed and every material used should be registered. So analysts estimate that around 50% of the time is spent on documentation. So if we take the example of a classic sample preparation workflow where a scientist needs to dilute each sample according to their weight, you have the first step where the scientist needs to write down the material used. Then she'll weigh the samples and note down the measured weights, which is obviously a two-step process. If there's any observations to be made, then this obviously requires that person to stop whatever they're doing and write it down. And then she's going to be calculating the dilution for each weight, bearing in mind that adding the calculated volume requires kind of like a back and forth between the paper and the bench. And in the end, everything that's happened has to be transcribed within the ELN. And that goes back to what I mentioned before around transcriptions taking, on average, about 30 minutes. So with a voice assistant, the whole process can be pretty seamless. And the scientist doesn't really need to remove the gloves or actually interrupt the workflow in any way. So the material can be scanned in step one or spoken to the assistant directly. The sample weights can then be automatically captured through a combination of instrument and system integration. Any observations can be recorded contemporaneously using voice. Calculations are automatic, and the assistant can then guide the dilution sample by sample. And then finally, the last step can pretty much be skipped, as everything is then automatically transcribed and then can be transferred into a corporate ELN automatically. And this is why we believe digital lab assistants can act almost like a hub for the lab, enabling kind of bidirectional data transfer between the scientist and the bench and the organization's lab informatics system. Having information recorded contemporaneously and placed into the required system, as well as requesting information and having it delivered from the system of origin. So if we look at pharmaceutical manufacturing, documentation is even more important. So regulatory authorities can demand access to this documentation pretty much at any time in order to ensure good manufacturing practices are followed. And as a framework to ensure data integrity and security, the ALCOA Plus principles have been pretty much widely adopted throughout the industry. And the key concepts are summarized by the actual ALCOA acronym, which stands for attributable, legible, contemporaneous, original, and accurate. And the plus is for the late addition of complete, consistent, enduring, and available. And voice assistants are a solution which we see has the ability to support each of these principles. Traditionally, a particularly challenging principle is always the contemporaneous aspect. In other words, recording information at the point of its generation as the experiment or the analysis is actually happening in real time. And this is the main strength of voice assistants, as they enable documentation literally at the point of experimentation while the gloves are basically still on. And this is why we believe voice assistants have a role to play in both a regulated and a non-regulated lab of the future. And I'm looking forward to discussing this widely with the super amazing panel that we have today. So first, what I would like to do is start off with a general question, which I always like to ask, which is the lab of the future. It can mean different things to different people, and depending on who you ask, you tend to get a very different answer. So what does it mean to you? And I'd like to kick that off by starting with Helen.
Yeah, thank you, John. So if I look into the future, the way I see is scientists are innovators and problem solvers, right? So they go to labs because I'm in research. So they go to labs, they, some testing some hypothesis or validating some results, right? As our technology matures and we have more gadgets in the lab, so scientists can do their experiment more seamlessly and effortlessly, right? So one of the things that can help scientists to do their job more efficient is voice assistant tools. So I see that, as scientists do their experiment, if they can capture the results as they're doing it with digital assistants, and they will save time to do the documentation, then they will have more time to do innovative work. The effort as the new generation who are very used to the digital world and they will really going to welcome those gadgets in the lab. The special setting in the lab is the lab space is a premium, right? So if we have very lightweighted device in the lab, it will really help scientists to carry out the experiment effortlessly. So I really see one of the area that we can really help is the digital assistant tool, voice activating tool. Back to you, John.
Sure. So, Robin, what do you think about the lab of the future? What does it mean to you? What do you think it means?
Just to add to what was already mentioned, I think another element of that is, how the data is collected, not only for you as a scientist, made available for instant analysis, but I also think it's something around, how do we share that more instantly with others across, sites or geographies. To the point, particularly now in this pandemic, we are so reliant on actual people physically in the lab. What can we bring, to not just here and now de-densify and all that, but actually more long term? How can we automate? Think about robotics. How, as was mentioned, the lab space comes at a premium. So how can we make it less dependent on physical presence in the lab? And that could be, robotics, automation. It could be, other tools or technologies that can help out. And I think voice has a role to play in that. But it's not the only. It's obviously not the only solution.
Excellent. Excuse me. So, Laura, what do you think about what's been said so far?
Firstly, I have to apologise for not being on the screen. I've taken voice literally, and yeah, going to demo the value of just voice. Yeah, I agree with an awful lot of what's been said. I think we're at a really interesting time where the technology around us is moving faster maybe than it's easy for us to adopt it in the lab, but it's such an opportunity to use the technology to multiply the science that we're doing. And I think we move towards an increasingly integrated world, and we see that in our own lives, at home with our smartphones and our voice assistants at home. And I think people are getting more and more used to it. So I think the time is really right to get in there and update our labs with similar technology.
Yeah. Cindy?
So I actually have kind of a different take on the lab of the future. I don't disagree with what's been said, but it's a matter of perspective, really. I think we all agree where we want to be is what everybody has described. But sometimes it's a little more simple. The lab of the future is getting off of paper. I've been in a situation where I walked into a new facility and literally probably 85% of it was paper-based. And lab of the future for me there is, let's actually get onto computerized systems and get off of paper. And it's not even, you can't even think about robotics and automation and all of that if you don't even have the basics in place. And so for me, it's really a situational thing of, am I just getting off of paper? Am I getting automated backups? Or am I in a situation where, yeah, we're automating, we want to look at robotics and so forth. And I've worked in both scenarios. And so for me, that's really, I approach it a little bit different because I see so many variations out there depending on where you're at. And even within a company, different facilities are at different levels of that lab of the future. And so for me, that's really, you have to step back and look at the immediate and then look at the bigger picture. The end game, the end goal, absolutely. We want automation, we want real time, we want all of these wonderful things. But I'm in a situation right now where, for me, the lab of the future is getting off of paper.
Yeah, I'm going to be diplomatic and say I agree with all of you. I love the question. When I used to work at LIMS companies, one of the questions I would always say is, what do you think that is? What do you think that technology is? And the same at ELN companies, I would use the same thing. What do you think that acronym really means? And just like this Lab of the Future term, it means different things to different people. And I see it almost like an onion, layers to an onion, or levels to a video game. You've got to start at a base level and solve that issue, and then you evolve. You go further than that. So like Cindy, you mentioned, you know, for some people it's just getting off paper. You know, the paperless lab has been a concept for what, 25 years now? It's you know, it's pretty old, but still people have that challenge. And so, you know, voice, you know, robots and Blade Runner type technology in the lab, if everything's still on paper, you've got some stuff you need to fix first before you can really go for that, you know. So you can start off at the very like lower end of the spectrum, like what you mentioned, Cindy, where you're just literally trying to digitize everything that would be manually written, and then you move all the way past, you know, what Robin mentioned, but also ending up where Helen mentioned, which is almost the ultimate goal of automation, right? Where you're freeing up intelligent scientists to work on frontier science. You know, it's freeing that cognitive kind of load to think of ideas, which is essentially what scientists are paid for. It's to think. So if you reduce the kind of the activities, the physical, the manual labor, the secretarial stuff that they have to do, it's better for everyone. You know, I think, you know, I love that question. I really do. So the next question, what I would like to ask you all is, you know, we kind of name drop voice there during that question. I'd like to look at that and kind of ask, you know, where do you see a place for technologies like voice assistants within that kind of vision of the lab of the future? You know, how does it fit in the bigger picture? Laura, I know you're particularly passionate about this, so I'd like to start with you. What do you think?
I think there's a few places that it fits, and when we've looked at this in GSK, there's a bit of a change management strategy really that I'm interested in looking at. I think to Cindy's point, particularly the paperless lab, right? We've got to get there, and you know, in some parts of our industry, we've been electronic lab notebook for over a decade, and that's great. In some parts, we're still actually using actual paper, and I think that tends to be in the more regulated spaces, and I think it's quite challenging for those guys now. They've got quite nice LIMS backends to the data collection, but at the front end, it tends to be paper. And I suspect that if we put our minds to it, we could probably have them leapfrog the electronic lab notebook and use voice and get straight into their LIMS that way. However, I would never like to trial that kind of large leap on a regulated part of the business, because that's such a challenge for those guys. You know, they've got to get things right. So the space where I think I would take it first is into discovery. And in the discovery space, the big challenge tends to be document what you do, right? Because you're not required to do it like the regulated end. So I think in places like assay transfer, where we might transfer between labs or to upscale or to move to a different site, I'd say it's been really valuable there, because I think what we don't do well in the discovery end is document. And I think voice could help us do that better, and certainly more contemporaneously.
Excellent. Cindy, what do you think about that?
Well, I definitely have to agree that it's a challenge in the regulated space. And I've seen it though, where I've been at places where it absolutely is a lot further along than what I'm currently experiencing, where we have gone direct to the ELN. And I think in the lab space in particular, voice would be very helpful. But we have some challenges here, especially like you said, regulated space. I support manufacturing and quality labs. So in the regulated space, I would love to find a way to make this work in manufacturing. My problem, because it's really hard to document things real time in manufacturing area, because you're gowned and you're gloved and you can't have the hardware and so on and so forth. But that's also the challenge that makes it very difficult to make this available in my manufacturing space, is how do I get the hardware in, whether it's earbuds, whether it's being able to talk through a fully gowned mask, possibly a hood. I want to be able to use this technology in that space, but I'm not quite sure how we get there. But I see a huge value if we can find out how to make that happen, because there's so much that doesn't happen until after the fact, which goes against ALCOA, frankly, and we all know it. We all want to find a better way. The lab space is easy in comparison, even in a regulated environment. But if I can get this into my manufacturing area, I would be a very happy person. You know, we have it in our R&D labs and our discovery space. We're already playing with that sort of technology. So I agree, that's your low-hanging fruit. But let's see if we can't get it into, you know, into the GXP areas and into manufacturing.
Robin, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I definitely agree. The early science sort of research areas, research labs, that's the areas where we are still experimenting, I think, with that's the right word to use with regards to voice. A bit more specific, so in those labs where, you know, people already mentioned it, you know, you're gloved up, gowned up, you know, hands-free operation is really a benefit of voice. It's easier to capture more data. So, for instance, in the animal surgery labs is a perfect place. You know, having that companion with you is of value. I think there are absolutely. I mean, this technology is still progressing at rapid pace, right? So I think parts of the ongoing sort of, you know, how do you deal with different languages? How do you deal with the actual change? You know, people not being used to speaking up loud. Is there some way of getting, you know, visual feedback on it instantly? So, you know, I think this will keep evolving. And somebody made the comparison already at home with, you know, the Alexas or the Googles or, you know, any other technology that we see at home. There's more than just the voice, right? There's timers as well, and that, you know, that has really come out in our case studies, that the additional, you know, let's call them features, actually were valued very high. So for instance, the timer ones were highly valued. So it's not just the voice. I think it's voice plus, you know, and even I'd like to throw video in there as well. You know, that's in many cases you want to, you know, you might want to record and play it back for somebody else. You know, that's voice plus video. So I think we'll see this evolve over the coming years, no doubt, and have a sort of a companion of different tools that can help us out.
Excellent. Helen, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, can you guys hear me? It's just,
yeah.
Okay, yeah, so in research lab, I have a very simple aspiration. If we can just get rid of mouse and keyboards, and it will make things much easier in the labs. So voice activating technology is very, very essential to enable that simple aspiration. You know, if people can just talk and things happen, that's magic, right? So, and then in addition to just smart documenting as things happen, you can also, you know, ask questions, you know, do simple calculations. People do calculations all the time in the labs, right? Conversions. If we can just use voice as an interface with computers, and, you know, providing visual aid for, you know, when you're in the labs, you do SOP, you carry some procedures with compliant to certain SOPs if it's complicated. If we have voice guided procedures and visuals, it's lightweighted, simple. It will make the lab experiences much more appealing and simple. So that's what I want to see, is use voice as interface with human and computer interactions, replace mouse and keyboards in the labs. That would be awesome.
Yeah, I think it kind of what you just said, Helen, the synergies between that and what Laura said in the beginning around, you know, the potential for voice to kind of leapfrog ELN, because ELN has still always been tethered to a mouse and keyboard, right? There was initiatives. I consulted a massive CRO. I won't say where it is in the world because you'll know straight away who it is. But they did the initial paper on glass kind of study. How could we get our ELN on a tablet? And it was one of these Panasonic Toughbooks, you know, the really old prior to the iPad type devices with the stylus. And everyone started using them, and I went back, you know, a few months later, and these guys were using them as sample trays, like, you know, $2,000 sample trays. And I think that's because there is this gap between execution of your experiment and the documentation. The documentation is very much an ELN kind of centric kind of thing, you know. And we've proven at LabTwin that kind of concept time and time again when it comes to R&D and discovery. Just purely getting stuff out of a scientist's head into a trusted system. We've seen voice, you know, very, very usable there. And Robin mentioned timers. Timers for us was just kind of a, I don't know, it was a kind of a quick addition to the program. We thought, you know, everyone has timers, you know, it's not really a big deal. Turned out to be a huge deal. Timers, you know, we went into the lab and one of our clients led us into the lab and they had up to 10 egg timers going off at different times. You know, they were stuck to the hood, they were stuck to the side of a centrifuge. They didn't know whether they were coming or going. There was all these bleeps all the time. They had like, you know, masking tape, decorator's tape with a Sharpie writing what the timer was representing. And with LabTwin, you're able to just say different timers, start a timer for the incubator, start a timer for, you know, this analysis. And the timer will go off and remind you what the timer was for. And we noticed in the lab, people would be walking around and all of a sudden they just kind of go, whoop, and they just turn around. And it was because their headset had told them that there was a timer going off. So we've kind of proven it in R&D, but obviously, and the next question is going to be centered around GMP. But it's interesting. No, somebody mentioned video. I think it was Robin. Nobody mentioned AR glasses, and it was actually something I remember sat down in my interview for this job at LabTwin, and they said, "Where do you see this being used?" And I said, "Well, if you could pair this with Google Glass in a GMP setting, where you're literally recording the video of literally you're taking it from the line and handing it to to guys in QC that are doing the testing alongside the production. You know, you're recording what batch, you know, you're taking the barcode scan of the label when you're taking it. You know, all that stuff combined becomes really, really powerful. Also things like animal surgery. You know, you're wearing AR glasses. You know, you're taking a video. Robin mentioned being able to show that video later on. You know, you have someone doing a particular, you know, an animal surgery. They can close the animal up. You know, there's not unnecessary suffering there. They can put the animal back in its cage to recuperate, and then you show the video to the colleagues and kind of go, you know, this was something interesting that we discovered. You know, so I see a real, especially in GMP, a real pairing between voice and AR, and that is something that we're looking at. You know, the ability to actually record and see what the scientists are seeing, whilst they're also transcribing. You know, they're also annotating what they're doing in real time. It's quite cool. Also, if anyone wants to speak up during this from the panel, you don't have to wait for me to say your name. If you agree or disagree with anything anyone's saying, feel free to speak up. I want this to be as natural as possible. But on that note, what I'll do is I'll move into the third question, which is centered a little bit more on GMP. So one of the things we've seen is GMP. It's sometimes perceived to be kind of lagging behind R&D in terms of digital transformation. And I think the fact that GMP requires more in terms of compliance, or it's seen to require more in terms of compliance, that's often blamed for that. So what do you think the challenges are of implementing something like a voice-powered smart assistant in a GMP environment compared to R&D? You know, what do you think are the missing requirements? Where do you think the biggest benefit is if those challenges are overcame? Cindy, I'd like to start off with you because you seem to be nodding your head at the time while I'm saying that.
Yeah.
What do you think?
And being right in the middle of GXP, you know, and being in that compliance space, and having worked in R&D, I think the biggest thing is perception. So more than anything else, one of the things that we're notorious in the GXP space of saying is, oh, well, we can't do that. It's going to cost too much. It's going to take too much to validate. Nobody will adopt it. And it's this perception that our space has to look and feel a certain way. And even getting something as simple as an ELN in place took 10 years longer than it took in R&D because, well, we have LIMS, we're okay. We had paper before we had LIMS, we're okay. And we're very, very slow to adopt new technologies. And it's a fear, I think, of the unknown. And everybody has that fear. But R&D is about, and discovery is about embracing the unknown. And so they're all about bringing in these technologies and adopting them. Whereas in our space, in the GXP space, we're very locked into the way we've always done it. And it really takes a champion or two or three to push that new technology and that adoption. And I think, you know, and I think Helen, you mentioned it early on about the newer generation and the younger scientists coming in. They're going to be the ones that help us push it into the GXP space because they're used to having their iPad, their phone, their whatever, their technology, their earbuds. And I know I've had a conversation with several of you about the whole concept of earbuds, and, you know, some of us from an older generation don't necessarily like that. It's not a comfortable thing in multiple ways. So these kids coming in, that's just the way they've always grown up. They're going to be the ones in the GXP space to help move that forward. You're going to get those of us having these conversations that know it needs to happen. They're going to be the ones that really push it and make that happen. And it does need to occur, I think, by going in and saying, oh, look, in my R&D lab over here in New Jersey, I've already got that technology. I've got a voice technology. I have this. It's limited use, but let's see if we can't apply that here in this GXP lab. And so I think that that's really, you find your champions and you help move it forward. And those of us who are having these conversations are going to be the ones convincing our compliance groups that it really is okay to do. And they're getting used to people like me going, hey, let's adopt this, let's make this happen, because it's going to simplify things, it's going to make our lives easier, we're going to be more compliant. And when the regulatory bodies come in and audit us, guess what? I can actually show them that all this stuff has been recorded real time. I didn't put it on a piece of paper and record it an hour later, or 2 hours, or 4 hours, or a week later.
Yeah, I agree with that. One of the things that sort of method execution ELNs were brought in was, you know, you get it, the FDA comes, they audit you, you know, they're looking under every nook and cranny trying to see, like, if you're following everything to the letter. And one of the questions that one of the jokey questions they ask is, you know, show me the SOP that the analyst has signed to show that they understand it. Now prove to me that they read it. and yeah. You can't, right? But what you can say is that with a technology like this, well, we can't prove that they've read it, but we can prove that they've been forced to follow the sequence of steps dictated by that protocol. And if you're not satisfied with that, do you want to hear the recording? Do you want to see the video of this actually happening? You can pick it at random. You know, they usually do that, right? They open a big folder and they'll pick something at random. You'll be able to show them that, and you can export that as, I don't know, maybe a data pack for them to take a look at. Yeah, I mean, like you mentioned, innovation has always been seen as this thing for R&D. GXP has been seen as something a little slower to move. It's that kind of nobody gets fired for buying SAP kind of argument. It's very, very slow and steady to adopt new things like that. So I agree with that. You also mentioned the earbuds as well. One of the things that kind of freaked us out a little bit when we started dealing with clients at LabSwim, we built this awesome technology and we put it in the labs, and a lot of the times we had to figure out how to make users comfortable from a hardware perspective. So we had to do so many studies on types of earbuds and whether they could wear them for 8 hours a day. Whether the compliance stuff allowed both of your ears to be obstructed by an earbud whilst you're working in the lab, and so we ended up settling on different things for different people. We settled on like a one-piece earbud for some people, with chargers nearby, because obviously these things don't last for 8 hours with the tiny little battery that's in them. So that's also something that we had to really learn fast, is around comfort. Around this sort of stuff in that area as well. So yeah, continuing on the GMP thread, Helen, what do you think about some of the things that Cindy said, and what some of the things you might have thought about on your own when you thought about this in GMP?
Well, so I don't work in GMP environment, so I have very little to offer in that regard. But I will say one thing, because you talk about devices. I think we test the visual aid, but not a Google Glass, but something else similar. But I think what strikes me is to take this technology and broaden the usage. The key is the connectivity and ease of use, right? So, for example, we want to replace the visual. Is if we have the computer, the real computing power in the cloud, and in the lab we just have a monitor that connects to the cloud. But the monitor can be replaced by a more modern devices. Is visual. It could be Google Glass, could be HoloLens, or could be like a visuals, screen that when it pop up when you need it, right? But the connectivity was voice activated technology, connect to the visual aid and connect to the computer. So it has to be seamlessly, and it also has to be lightweighted, right? Some of the devices, when scientists wear them, it causes the loss of balances for whatever reason. So those devices need to also still mature and get to the next stage. I really see the connectivity of those devices seamlessly. It will elevate the experiences when scientists carry out experiments in the lab. Sorry, not really answer your question, but just share that what I see in the
that's
future.
Great.
Mm-hmm.
So, Laura, what do you think?
Yeah, so I guess we probably all have some battle scars on this, and mine started. I was a discovery scientist to begin with, and then I went and spent some time working in very late stage, supporting phase 3 trials. I was required to type barcodes into a spreadsheet, and so I got a barcode scanner and freaked out my quality department because I'd changed the process. And so that's real, right? That's really there, and it's there for a good reason. But nevertheless, we've got to move things on. And I think the mantra that was taught to me at that point was that really you have to do it on the back of new product, and that might be, if you're in the D part of R&D, then that maybe is a phase 1 trial that you can see coming through. So let's try the technology on that. Let's pull the technology with the product. If you're out into the manufacturing space, it's probably your new product introduction site that you want to try these things at before you put it elsewhere, because you've got a little bit more wiggle room. And to Cindy's point, championing an innovation, and we do need to innovate, right? One of the flippant arguments that I usually use is EasyJet employs pilots, right? It's a budget airline, but it still needs a pilot, and so we need to be moving along and taking these things with us. But one of the things that I've kind of picked up on recently in these type of discussions at conferences is the massive amount of effort that we need to pay attention to change management. And I think the statistic that's quoted is generally that success in a technology introduction is 10% on the technology you pick and 90% on the people parts, the championing, the change management, the rolling it out, the making sure it works. And I don't think we as an industry really do that very well. I think we kind of tend to sort of throw things at people a little bit more than maybe we should. If 90% of it is about change management, I'm not sure that we generally hit that. So I think that's a space where I like working is the how do we get these technologies in, not because the technology doesn't talk for itself, but just that people are busy doing regulated activities, and that's a hard ask. But I guess if I reflect on some things that might be more real than perception, and this might be a bit of a question really. I think about an automation project I once did where we wanted to use visual actually in that instance. to check for something down a manufacturing line. And we realized that if we started putting a recorder on it, everything that we recorded would become subject to regulatory inspection. And I wonder if we've got some similar issues in the voice space. You know, when we write things down nice and neatly, then we control what the regulators see. And I just wonder if there's some issues there that we need to overcome. And I'm not saying that because I don't want us to. I'm saying it because I do want us to. And let's figure it out.
Yeah, I see parallels with corporate email policies, right? That every 12 months they purge all the emails. And that's not because these companies necessarily have anything to hide. It's just, it makes some stuff so much more manageable from a legal perspective if they were ever to be audited about something and there was maybe an insinuation in an email that an employee knew something about a bad batch that was shipped, you know, or something like that, which might have been true, might have been false, but the fact that email existed means that they find something and then it just kind of mushrooms out and then becomes a bigger deal than it really needed to be, you know. And that is something that I think, you know, we're only going to be able to figure that out once it's tested, you know, from legally. You know, I'm seeing the same similarities around voice-based authentication. You know, is voice effective as a biometric electronic signature? The answer is we don't really know. It's not really been tested yet. You can look at ISO 17025 and you can interpret that, but it still needs to be tested before doing that. And so maybe, you know, the way I see it right now is maybe the voice is the equivalent of your raw data that still needs to be interpreted, and then your notes that you include in your experimental report, or more accurately, if you're working in GMP, the stuff that ends up in the LIMS is the equivalent of that final auditable data. But again, this is something that really needs to be investigated, and we're working with partners right now to try and validate that. We're openly looking for additional partners as well, because we know that this is something that we need to crack. But Laura, that's an awesome question. That's something that we've actually been looking at the moment. Robin, what do you think around digital assistance, GMP, and that kind of sphere of thinking?
If I look at GMP, and by the way, I'm in early science and not have a load of visibility of GMP, but I do know, in AstraZeneca at least, they were adopting AR and VR earlier than R&D was, and that's interesting. You know, it was particularly a use case in tech transfer, and maybe it has to do with you know, things are more process driven, they are more standardized, and therefore impacts are bigger than in an early science lab, because, you know, you have so many different diverse workflows, so you tend to work with, you know, smaller groups of people. If you're, you know, let's take the voice example of animal surgery labs. I mean, that's a specific use case, and, you know, compare that to an impact in a GMP lab is probably a bit smaller. I think, you know, it's a bit different. Impacts will be bigger, you know, the later on you are, in my opinion. But you do run into challenges of validation, of course. I like your comment around voice, and that's how we're actually to date, you know, using it more as a personal assistant rather than okay, this is a direct input to an actual source system. It's your companion, so to speak, and then you can take it where you need to take it. The obvious questions we're getting now is, well, couldn't you integrate this directly into our operational systems? And that's where those questions directly come in. It's like, well, do we want that or not? So we're still working that through at this point.
Yeah, that's a challenge. Well, it's not so much a challenge, it's just something that we need to figure out is, you know, we have some clients who want, and this is more appropriate with R&D, but it's just as irrelevant with GMP. We've got clients that want to put everything the scientist says directly into the ELN. And then we've got other clients that kind of go, we want to give the scientists the control over what is exposed to basically the corporate ELN or the corporate LIMS system. And you can imagine with a technology like digital assistants, and it's still, it's still finding its feet. It's proven in a lot of different use cases, but it's still a virgin technology. Do you really want the situation where a scientist, I don't know, says something bad about their boss, and then that's in the ELN, and then that's date stamped, time stamped. They need to give a reason and an electronic signature if they want to change that result. We've got to watch out for things like that. And so personally, and I don't speak for any company or anything, like my personal thing is that I see a staging area type situation where you have your personal notebook, then you decide what is transposed into the corporate ELN, and maybe that's your final experimental report, maybe that's your final data set. Even when you get data off your HPLC, you would still summarize that information and conclude your findings. And I see this assistance stuff going the same way. The key is,
I agree.
What's audited.
I agree, John. I think you have to be really mindful of what culture you're trying to drive. If you are saying from now on everything you will ever say will be recorded, it's going to drive a certain behavior. And I don't think well, again, this is to your point, my personal opinion. Yep. Not speaking for any company here, but I think you have to be mindful of what that would do to a scientist. When I hear, for instance, on a Zoom call or whatever technology is being used, this will now be recorded. It leads to an instant reaction, and I think we just need to be mindful of that. I think the scientists needs free thinking, sort of space to think and articulate and reason and even innovate and sometimes. By having that recorded at all times is, I think, a really bad idea.
And when you get into the GXP space, it's kind of a different consideration, which is if this, to your point, becomes your raw data. I'm now speaking everything, all of my observations and everything out loud into this device. This now becomes my raw data. So where do you draw the line between I jotted it on a sticky note next to the computer and then transcribed it, to I'm now editing what I have said out loud into the, I've now voiced this, I have a voice print with a date timestamp, which you didn't have with the sticky, but that's not now always going to be there. And how do you then explain to the regulatory bodies how you determined what you edited, how you edited that into your final result that gets recorded and used in your COA and used to release product that goes into our patients? And to me, that's a bigger, I understand, Robin, what you're saying about, you suddenly stop and think about what you say and how you say it and what you really communicate. And you automatically, we all do it. We're on camera, we're being recorded. We filter what we say, most of us. But if you start doing that in the GXP space, that raises a whole lot of question about, well, how did you decide what you said all of this, and yet your final result is this? How did you make that determination that was really the appropriate end result? And that, I think, is going to be the harder part to validate and then justify in the future to auditors.
Absolutely. So I want to change tack here and give a situational question. Bearing in mind the situation we all find ourselves in with the whole COVID-19 thing, which congratulations to Rob and his company with the whole 90% effective vaccine. It's coming out. I think the world needs that kind of news at the moment. The question I have for you guys, and no one in particular, so just feel free to call out if you have something to contribute here. Do you think that digital assistance technology or voice assistants can help with supporting remote work? Have you seen a push for any changes in digital initiatives to support the current COVID situation? I myself I'm working in the UK at the moment. My company is based in Berlin. I find myself separated from them. You know, when you think of your situation, you know, having to collaborate scientifically, you know, do you see any applications for this kind of technology in that kind of environment?
I think in the R&D space, if I can, and I work with a lot of my colleagues, a lot of them on my team are supporting R&D labs. And I do think, although we do try to be on site more, the scientists, in my space specifically, all my lab people are on site. But in R&D, we have kind of a mix because we can't have everybody on site. And I do see where it might prove useful if you're sharing information. So I might have two people working on an experiment together. One can go into the lab, one can't. If I'm using this voice assistant, I'm actually recording that, and they can go and pull that data real time. You know, I can sit here and I can do it as a video conference while they work, which is very distracting, disruptive, and you have to worry about whether or not the technology with the networks and so forth will hold together long enough. Or they record it, I can go back and I can review their work. I can look at that in an hour or so after they're done. And I see that that would actually be, we're not using it, but I see where that could be very applicable and very useful for sharing that experiments or sharing it across sites. If I'm running something across multiple locations across the globe, you know, we're all multinational companies. So what better way to share that data than have it using voice and having that recorded and being able to easily send that over to my colleague in another state, another country, even the lab across the street.
Yeah, just to add to Cindy there, it's the same in AstraZeneca. It's a real challenge. I think I started with that. You know, the reliance on people physically in the lab is still there, and you can't do everything remotely. So we've accelerated some of the tools to do more remotely. So, for instance, you know, desktop sharing, and you know that you from your home can log into the particular lab system or lab PC. You know, accelerated the rollout of that. But it's also about, well, you know, somebody can't come to work or wasn't in the lab yesterday, but now today the capacity has been reached, can't go into the lab. How do you transfer that work instantly over to somebody else? So that means that during the experiment, we need to be much better at facilitating the data capture as and when the experiments are going. And that's, you know, if I were to pick up an experiment from somebody in the early science labs, that is really, really hard, because you can't, you know, we're probably still at a stage where a lot of the, let's take the ELNs, we're still writing up on Friday afternoons, right? So what happens during the week is collected and added, and then we'll do the write-up whenever I have time. So that becomes really difficult then to do training, to do handover. So I definitely think there's, and it's not just voice, but I do think there is an application of voice even in that scenario to facilitate this instant data collection as and when my experiments are running. Absolutely. I think there's also, you know, that's more around the actual scientific data itself and making that instantly available. I think we have, particularly in the early science labs, with such a diverse set of instruments that we have, you know, how we do that and share that data in a much more standardized way, maybe a more open industry standard way. I think we have a long road to go there still.
Yeah. And I think it comes full circle to something Helen mentioned earlier around connectivity. You know, in order for that to happen, you know, a lot of different technologies are going to have to play nice with each other. You know, you can't just use voice in isolation. You know, voice has to be integrated to instrumentation. It has to be able to access data lakes and ELNs and LIMS and other solutions, which right now, you know, the APIs of some of those third-party products are shaky at best. You know, so how do you do it so that everything is connected in a way that, you know, it isn't just recording notes and storing them in a different place. It's about how do you access that information whilst you've still got the gloves on, whilst you're at your desk at home. You know, you need to be able to make that data available in real time. You know, I think that's a a cool concept to kind of close this webinar out. I think we've got 3 minutes left, and so what I'd like to do is just ask a final question to all the panelists, a real kind of quick fire one, if you would, which is, what is the number one thing that you guys want to achieve in 2021? What's the biggest thing on your plate? And I guess I'll start with Laura on that.
My current role actually is in enterprise knowledge management, which is there's my big goal: get the organisation speaking the same language to each other is my big goal. So I don't know that lab voice comes in there, but that's my big goal. My thought on lab voice actually for 2021 that might be important is we're trying to get people back into our labs in a COVID secure way before the vaccine is jabbed put in our arm. And it occurs to me there may be application here for turning on instruments. If I say the name of my home voice assistant, my oven will turn on, my lights will turn on, my all sorts of things can happen. If I could walk into the lab and not have to touch the same kit as everybody else because I got it to turn on, that would be great. Now, that's always been hard in discovery biology. You can't take your laptop into a discovery biology lab because there's always biological contamination issues there. So there's one that I would like to do in 2021, because it would make us COVID safe, quite quickly.
Excellent. Robin, what about yourself?
So we spoke about lab of the future, and then taking Cindy's comment all the way back to 2021. There's some of the more practical things. I would say accessible lab data, making our data more accessible, more reusable, findable. That has got to be the focus for 2021 for us.
Excellent, thank you. Helen, what about yourself?
Yeah, I also echo what Cindy was saying earlier, is really centralized data captures and really apply analytics. Using those data can inform decision making earlier. So it's learning from our past experiences and guiding the future work. That's our goal for 2021.
Excellent. And finally, Cindy?
I figured you were going to save me for last on this one. Really, my goal is to get my site off of paper. We're getting there. We have LIMS, we have ELN, we have all of our instruments, but we still do so much on paper. We don't do proper backups, that sort of thing. We have them, but we need to really get it into a modern age and standardize with the rest of BMS and get us up to speed with the rest of the organization. And like I said, I'd love by the end of the year to not have to worry about getting paper cuts when I take care of setting up users, because I'm grabbing those paper forms.
Excellent.
Simple
this
needs.
has been amazing. Yeah, I mean, this is brilliant. I thank you very much, guys. Before I hand it over to Mark, just Cindy, Helen, Robin, Laura, thank you so much for your time. I think we've had a great discussion here. And I look forward to interacting with you guys again. And thank you everyone in the audience as well who's been kind enough to share some questions that we had a chance to ask today. So over to you, Mark.
Yeah, I'll echo what John said as well. I'd like to say special thanks to the panelists, Cindy, Helen, Laura, Robin. Special thanks to John for moderating. I think you've done a cracking job. It's been really interesting. And thank you to LabTwin for sponsoring. Finally, thanks to the audience for taking the time out to listen. So yeah, that brings a session to a close. I will follow up with everybody over the next couple of days. We'll also receive a playback feature as well, as I mentioned before. If you could all fill out the survey, as I mentioned, it's helpful for us to inform and shape future events, any sort of feedback you've got. Other than that, thank you very much to everybody once again, and I hope you all have a great day. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.